started it right after Mom. Anyway. Alright, sorry, we had a bit of a delayed.
Too many people in the shop this morning, so we're just trying to get things settled down and ready to work here. So I'm going to start by making sure my knife is sharp.
Tyler said good morning.
Good
Tim
morning.
said hi.
Good morning and hello. Okay, so little recap of what we did yesterday. So we got the frog fit on the bow, on the button. We refined the camber and the graduations. We used the cord here to pull the bow up to tension. And when we were done yesterday, I spent an additional hour going back and absolutely refining the camber. I didn't take any more material off. The really important thing about doing that is this is really the only difference between a fine handmade bow and a so-so bow, and that is how well the camber and the graduations work together. If you really refine that, you will have a good playing bow. Shape of the head isn't all that important. Shape of the frog's not as important. That's aesthetics. So it's worth taking the time to make sure that the camber, the straightness, and the graduations are all working together. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go ahead and round the stick. So we'll start by, I'll just make a pencil mark here right in front of the frog. And then I like to have the bow start to be round after it leaves the winding. So that's going to be 75 millimeters. So mark that. It's making a shadow. Okay, and then I'm just going to put a piece of tape right there. So, piece of tape. Let's go around the stick. Okay. Now I'm going to take my pencil and I'm just going to make some rings down the stick, and this will just help visually see how well the bad shadow right here, Kate. Maybe this light needs to be moved. Move around a little bit. So I'm just making these rings around here. And this will make sense here in a few minutes. It's hard to see where you've planed and where you haven't planed sometimes, so it's just having a little bit of a visual aid. Okay, so then I'm going to use both my round plane and my flat plane to start making this 16-sided. So that's going to be my first goal.
Are you starting with, and
okay.
before and after comparison?
So yesterday I made a little error on my weight, or my math, I should say. So right now the stick weighs 40. Add the frog and the button to it, and it comes out to 56.5. I think we said 53, and I'm not really sure. Maybe there was I didn't have the bow might have been sitting on the table or something. So so we'll round that off, and we should have a bow that weighs 53.5 after we round it. So go ahead and start planing down these corner facets.
Tim's mom's watching. She said your work is amazing.
So now you can see, it's really easy to see where you're, where you've planed and where you haven't. I'll just take this off the stick. And so I'm going to plane, probably didn't say this earlier, I stay away from the head just a little bit, half a centimeter so that it gives me options on how I'm going to do my chamfers, the decorative part as it comes around the head. So we're going to do the same thing here, and I just put my finger in the way so I don't plane that area. Okay, then I'll work my way back.
Wesley said Jimmy's here.
Yeah. Yeah, my friend Jimmy had to have surgery on his foot, and he managed to have that done like 2 days before they closed down all the elective surgeries. He lucked out. Okay. Remember not to plane too close to the head here. Okay, so you can see the pencil marks make it really easy to see where you have and haven't planed.
How does this process differ from if you had decided to leave the stick octagonal?
So obviously it wouldn't be not doing what I'm doing now. I would have just left it. If you're going to leave it octagonal, you're going to have to check. I always make a bow as if it's going to be octagonal. That way I've done the best job I can with planing the stick and making all of these facets. When you look down them, you want them to look like they're just as straight as an arrow, and they're not doing this as they go down the stick. So obviously if I was gonna leave it octagonal, I would just from here I would just go ahead and finish the shaping of the head. And then when you barely lose any weight if you have an octagonal stick, the shaping of the head, you're taking so little material off of that you might take off a couple of tenths at the most. So it's really not a loss worth worrying about. You can just go back if you need to and even these up a little bit. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to my curved bottom plane and do the 3 upper or the, corners here.
I brought one of my bows to a convention and put it in the new makers exhibit. And there was another bow maker that came in to look at it, and he asked me, "How do you keep the facets so straight?" I said, "Well, I have a scraper plane." And I'm pretty sure that's not what he was talking about, because he gave me the dirtiest look. But I think he had finished making his bow on the bus trip there. So. Jack asked, "Do you measure stick deflection?"
Not for every bow, but I certainly have measured it. I use a 1 pound weight and thousandths of an inch in deflection. So the typical deflection is going to be between 160 to 190 thousandths for a violin bow. 160 is really stiff, almost getting less playable because it's so strong. So that 190 is actually probably pretty close to where most bows are. And I've done deflection on old bows, and often they're 200, 210 even. Anything after that's getting pretty remarkably flexible. But a lot of these old bows that people really ooh and ah over are a lot more flexible than you think.
Why do you think players have started going more towards stiffer bows?
I think there's a lot of reasons for it. One reason I think is if you, the best grip for me is a very relaxed grip where you're just, there it is, there's your grip. But there's a lot of players will play with a grip that's like this. And so if your hand is like this, you don't have as much leverage to bend the bow. If your hand's like this, you've got more. And then I think there's also a phenomenon of the quality of the training that players are getting, that they're not hearing that there's 2 ways to get volume. One way is to use pressure, and the other way is to use bow speed. And I see all too often that players are just using pressure, and they're the ones that scrape their bow really badly. I used to rehair a Tourt bow for Daniel Majeski, who was the concertmaster of the Cleveland Orchestra. And he played on this bow that's known as the Rubinoff Tourt. It was David Rubinoff's bow. And it was so flexible, it was difficult to rehair because it just wouldn't stretch the hair out nicely. You had to actually make the hair extra long to accomplish a nice clean rehair on it. And you would think that, here's a guy who's a concertmaster, he's got to play strong and loud and be heard and everything, and he did a great job with that bow. So, it's a lot of it again is about, the way you play.
What benefit did he get from playing on a bow that flexible.
So his comment to me, and I asked him the exact thing, what do you get out of playing on a flexible bow? And he says, very quickly, he answers, infinite color. He has so much more depth of, sort of quality of sound in his toolbox that he can get out of that bow. Okay, so we've got this now. It's 16-sided. And we're going to go ahead and make it, 32-sided. So I'm just going to go ahead now and just lightly take off all of these corners. And usually to do this, it's best if you have one single light source in the room. You can take your light and keep it low, and so it makes a high contrast between light and dark, and that allows you to see any little ridge that you have, so you can just take your plane and make it go away.
I have it zoomed in directly on that light. Would you like me to turn the other two soft boxes off?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
I see really well here. Okay, I'll go back to the round plane here. Do the same thing.
Jack said I have a bow I made with a deflection of 210. It's too soft, and I can tell you that I am playing it every day, and I will not play a stiff bow anymore.
I think once a player learns how to play a flexible bow, they have something again in their toolbox that is really special, and it's not something that conservatory students are willing to listen to. So mostly you see mature players that are willing to try those things.
Oh, we had one girl who was a violinist came in to get her bow rehaired and asked if there was anything that we could do about it because it was so heavy. But it was a viola bow.
Yeah, she was playing a viola bow instead of a violin bow. Okay. Okay, getting these corners just about taken care of. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to just eliminate any little ridge that I can find. And as you can see, almost all of that pencil mark is gone now. And again, one of the tendencies is your, your as you make a bow, your planes are getting less and less sharp, and the tendency is to not bother to resharpen them. But right now is when you want them to be the sharpest, because if you get bad shatter because you've had to put the blade out farther, so it'll cut, you'll pay for it right here.
Can you recover from shatter marks
No,
at this point?
You've spent hours trying to get exactly the right camber and the right dimensions, so I guess you can, but you might have to make some changes. It's just worth getting everything sharp. Yeah, word to the wise too. I remember early on I had some of those Condent planes. Not sure if they're still making them, but they're just a block of aluminum, and they've got the groove in it where the blade is in, set screw that holds the blade in place. And I was doing this, rounding off a bow, and the plane slipped off, and the blade sticks out of the edge, and I put this gigantic gouge in the side of the stick, and it was done. It could not be salvaged.
Lots of colorful language.
Maybe. So if you have one of those planes, be really careful with it, and it certainly wouldn't hurt to just put a plate over the side of it so that cannot happen. The time it would take to add a little plate is far less than starting over again with a bow. Okay, so the top's pretty well rounded off. I'm going to go back with my flat plane here, hit the bottom.
Jack asked, what is the deflection you might think the stick will end with?
This stick will probably be, I'm going to guess, 185, 190, somewhere in there.
So it's going to be on the softer side.
It's on the softer side. I would say the average bow is going to deflect somewhere around 190 anyways. A new Shard or a Sartori might be a little bit more. But not always. Voran's bows are going to be probably in the 200 range. And that's probably why they're less popular and therefore have a lower value now than a Sartori.
Are there some makers that leave their sticks kind of elliptical?
Probably the most well-known maker that would have done some different shape than either round or octagonal would have been Arthur Vigneron. He's probably one of the best bass bow makers. He would leave the two lower side facets still sharp, so it made kind of a teardrop shape or a triangular shape, which I'm assuming he was either thinking one or two things. Either it was going to make the bow a little bit stronger side to side, or it was aesthetic. And surely it's both.
Jack
Okay.
asked, how much deflection do you lose from octagonal to round?
30 thousandths.
So you can make a bow that's 160 into a bow that's 190.
190. You might not lose quite that much, but it's going to be pretty close. Okay, so I've got this rounded. You can just kind of feel around, see if you can feel any little ridges you might want to get rid of. Sometimes they're just tough to get rid of all of them. This sandpaper is going to do quick work on most of these, but if there's anything that's significant, you want to knock it down now. Okay, it feels pretty good. So now I'm going to start working on finish shaping the head and then rounding the head. So I like to take a piece of paper towel. And my favorite towel is Bounty, full sheet, no flowers.
Might be a little bit difficult to get a hold of right now.
Good grief.
I went to the grocery store yesterday. No toilet paper in the whole store.
Yeah.
I have 3 rolls. Hopefully that'll last me till this is over.
Okay. So the reason I do this, 2 things. One is it keeps my dirty hands off of the raw wood. And especially in the summertime, if I'm holding onto the stick without anything protecting it, it's gonna dirty the pores, and I don't want to do that. Second thing is that it makes the stick significantly thicker. It's a lot easier to hold on to. Carpal tunnel is something that makers do get, so it's just something to consider. So now I'm going to go ahead and refine this shape here, and I'm just going to do this without any kind of template or anything. So I'm going to go ahead and lower this just a little bit.
I've seen some makers use like white cotton gloves. Is that something you could?
They're fine, but that doesn't give you that extra diameter there to hold on to. So aesthetically, for me, this nose, beak, whatever you want to call it, looks best if the low spot is right where the Pernambuco meets the ebony and not farther back. It just gives it this really strong, intentional look. And so you think about it this way, this would be like a golden spiral. Once this curve starts to bend, it never gets straighter again. It keeps continuing to go, and if you were actually going to continue this curve, it would come back and around. You don't want this to just sort of be this lazy ski slope where it comes down and goes off here into nowhere. This is an intentional curve. It comes around and back like this. So you can, use a knife, use a file, whichever is working best for you here. One thing about using a knife here is if you kind of crash into, your finished shape, you'll have to figure out a new shape, I guess. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to recheck my thickness here. This measurement is going to be between about 12 or 13, so it's more than 13 right now, so it's a little bit chunky this way for my taste. So I'm going to make it a little bit thinner. And so you can do this again with a file or a knife. It's completely up to you. It's worth taking a file and putting a little chamfer up here so that if you're cutting in this direction up here, you're not going to split into the stick. That's looking a little better. Bit of a humped curve here yet still. So keep cutting. And this is, this is definitely, if this is your bow, you can shape this any old way you want to.
Is there anything you would recommend avoiding when it comes to head shapes?
Yeah, well, the big part is you got to have enough meat here to keep this from coming apart. Bow's under a lot of stress, and even more stress when it's being played. And we'll get a little bit more into the shaping, the rounding of the bow here in a few minutes. So I think, if you look at, if you really study what the old makers did, there's a lot of, I don't necessarily say similarities, but there's I think there's reasons why this dimension is that not less than 12, and the height is pretty much never more than 24 millimeters, because if you make things too tall, then the bow feels weak. If you make this too thin, then it gets weak and more prone to breaking. Of course, to the other side, you also want to keep the mass to a certain amount, because that is going to influence the balance of the bow. Sometimes this is hard to see what your profile looks like, because when you're filing it, you might be a little bit more angled one direction or the other. So you might keep tweaking this right until you're ready to get the sandpaper out. So still have a little flat spot here that's got to go. It's looking better. Starting to like that. Okay. I like it. Okay, take a little bit, round this a little bit more. So here's a good tip for the shaping of the head. So you think about it. You have two different components. You have the stick and you have the head. So think of the stick as going off in here to space, and the head coming straight up this way. And at a certain point, you have to blend these two together. Do the blending intentionally. Don't when you're sanding this down, you want to make sure that you're not killing this line here. You don't want this line of the head to get to a certain point, say in the middle of this head, and then start to droop down into the head. This always looks better aesthetically if the curve of the head curve of the head and the curve of the top of the stick look intentional. And so what I mean by that is once this curve starts to bend down, that moment where it starts to curve, that is the tightest that's ever going to be. So you think about it. So if you've kind of mushed this a little bit, it starts to curve a little bit, and then it gets to a tighter curve. You don't want to do it that way. You want it to be a tight curve and then flatten out as it goes into the head. Now this is going to differ if you're doing like a Violin style or a Sartori style where it's very rounded. You still, when you look at those bows, they still have a moment where they go from the curve of the stick to the curve of the head. And then when you come down into the head, there's a moment where you've changed from this curve to this curve. And once you start that curve, it continually gets tighter and tighter until it goes around into the ivory tip. If you follow those rules, it doesn't matter what shape you do in your head, it'll always look much more aesthetically pleasing. So, okay, so got our shape the way we want it. I'm going to take a pencil and I'm just going to blacken up the center here. Okay, I'm going to just kind of move sideways here so you can see what I'm doing. So now I'm going to take my knife and I'm going to cut a bevel here, or a chamfer. Now this is kind of an important part of the design of your head too. You can have this angle so that's very sharp. You leave a really sharp center ridge and then it curves all the way back to the back of the head. Or you can leave this rather blunt too, and everything in between. And if you look at old bows that have a sort of a more modest angle and curve into the head are bows that tend to survive years than bows that have a really pronounced center ridge. So I think it's a mistake to make that center ridge sharp. So you think about it, if you have this real sharp center ridge and something hits that, if it's blunt, it won't leave a mark. But if it's a really sharp edge, the wood's not as hard as this metal, and it will leave a mark. And anytime you have a nick, that's a place where a crack can start. Same thing with stand tapping. It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. Every time you do that, you leave a nick, and that's a place where you can get a crack to start in your stick. So, players, if you're listening, don't destroy your bow by doing that stand tapping stuff. Okay, so I'm using my little round file here. Getting this started. And as this curve comes down, you may end up changing your angles a little bit too to accomplish the shape that you want. Okay, I'm going to go for the other side now. Sometimes this cuts really easily with a knife. Other times you're just going to have to give up and do the finishing with a file. And how perfectly straight this center ridge is, that's just a personal taste thing. I think a lot of makers think it's super important that it's perfectly straight.
Having that graphite on there helps you keep it that way too, right?
Well, it just gives you a reference for sure. Maybe it's a little bit bragging rights if you do it nice and straight. You look at torts and picots, they're often not very straight. Tort, they're almost never straight. But, you know, his bows are worth now more than a luxury home, so.
Dennis said as you're blending the chamfers into the nose, how deep do you go with the chamfer? Does it stop at the ebony liner or continue into the tip armor?
This angle, let's see if you can see it here. So it kind of flattens out and it comes to a point close to the very tip here. So that's why I was saying that the angle changes as you get into it. You don't want, especially on this first one, you won't want to go down all the way to the ebony. You want to stay up enough so that you can get two more chamfers that get you to the ebony. Okay, gonna get in here with the needle file, finish up this side.
That I can't film.
Nope, sorry guys, I'm hiding it from you.
That's a secret. You'll have to come to a workshop. Sometimes you use your little block. Why aren't you using your little block?
That's for chamfers.
Oh.
We'll get there.
Okay.
Okay, so I got my first chamfer done. It looked like they're pretty good. The center ridge is pretty close to the middle. Okay, now we're going to do a second chamfer.
So you don't mark any of this stuff out. You just kind of eyeball it.
All eyeball. You could draw it out if you wanted to sort of get some ideas of what you're doing.
I think while you're sanding, I'll just film you.
With a handheld.
Well, no, I was thinking I'll just film you from inside while you're outside.
Oh, that's all right. We don't need to do that. Okay. One little thing that you can do is when you're trying to design your own, learn a head design, is I'll do, this little flat. So basically it's, 3 millimeters thick or so, and I can get some idea what my chamfer is going to look like and sort of where the rounding is going to be, where I'm going to sort of my transition point from round to flat into the side. It's still not flat. It still has the curve of the tip plate, but this is a lot cheaper than making a bow. Here's one of Kate's. So you can get some ideas of how to do some of these things. This didn't get rounded, but instead of just making a flat a metal design, you can do these heads, and you can go, oh, this is really nice, or wow, I'm really glad I didn't put this on a bow because I don't really like it now. So it's just a way to get a little practicing in, doing some of those shapes.
If we get this new 3D printer, do you think maybe we'll print up some of the violin heads that you've scanned? Do you think they'll be
Yeah,
good
I've
enough?
been 3D scanning violin bows, frogs, and heads and such, and so we've talked about being able to print those up and use them as study guides for people that want to learn different shapes, and maybe help learn some identification. If you're making a copy of a bow, you can have that right on your bench instead of a many $1,000 bow, and have a really good representation of it. In our next segment here, I can show you some samples of that. Doing this would be a really great place to be very ambidextrous, so you could kind of do it this exactly the same way on both sides. Okay. So second chamfer is done. Let's see if I can highlight these corners a little bit without making them too messy. There's that. Can you see that, Kate?
Not really, but
Okay.
yeah, kinda.
So I'm staying about a millimeter or so away from the center ridge. So now I'm going to make my next chamfer here.
Is the shape of your chamfer changing
As I get into the curve to go to the nose, I am changing my knife is at this angle on the side, and as I get closer to the tip, it's turning in.
So it's kind of flattening out a bit?
Just flattening out, I guess, or yeah, I'm not really sure how to describe that. Coming down just about to the ebony, not quite. Okay, do the other side.
Oh, that light isn't in the way. I can't really see. There. Perfect, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so one of the things here too is that as you're cutting your chamfers in here, you want to try to follow the ridge line. If you're digging in really far, then you're going to make really hollow cheeks here. It's an aesthetic thing. If you're doing something that's maybe a bit more of a swan-like head where the nose is much longer, like a cello, then you can go in a little bit farther. But I think you want to leave this nice and healthy here. It gives you plenty of room too for your mortise. Okay, so we're going to do one more chamfer here. And this one sometimes a little bit dangerous because it's prone to a little, not splitting, but you get little splinters that'll pop up. So sometimes you have to just do it with a file. This is cutting okay. But you're just coming down to the tip plate. You're not following it around and going into the tip. Let's see if this one's going to be as cut as well.
That one looks like it was maybe a little bit easier on the other side.
This cut's a little easier, yeah. Okay. So pretty equal on both sides. So now I'm going to go ahead and start filing this down. So I'm going to use this little flat file here.
So are you just taking down the ridges, or are you starting to blend at this
I'm
point?
blending everything together now.
Is that number 4?
This is a number 4-ish. This is actually a Nicholson. It's not Swiss, so they have a little bit different numbering system. Well, it says 4. Yeah, all right. So I'm taking care not to dig down this way. Just trying to get this all moved off here. Blend this together. Okay. I'm going to go to my needle file. I'm using, often for the head, I'm using the flat side of my half round needle file to blend this all together.
Are those Gros Bay? Or
These
are
are
they just
Gros Bay, and they're number, let's see, Gros Bay number 2. Number 2 cut. And this is one of those times when you want to have absolute control of your tools. You don't want it to slip and gouge into anything. It would be well, make you unhappy for sure.
How long does a set of files usually last you?
Oh, I don't know. You can probably get at least a half a year's making out. 20 or 30 bows maybe.
With the needle files?
With the needle files. Just depends on what you're using them on. Okay, just want to get everything blended together here. And again, we're maintaining the line of the head of the stick coming through and the line of the head coming through. We're not blending them together yet. We will do that intentionally here later. Okay, now we're going to do the other side.
How many bows have you made so far this year?
This bow is number 14, I believe. Trying to keep a one bow a week pace. Going to be a little easier now without people coming in for rehairs or anything like that.
Is there a bow that you made that you wish you hadn't sold so you could have kept it for yourself?
Well, there's always bows that I'm really pleased with the way they came out, but I kind of get a bigger charge out of having other people, like them as much as I do. So
Antonio said, "What is the weight of this bow and your balance point?"
The stick was 40 grams, and I do not follow the balance point of my bows. I will document it when it's all done. But if you're using reasonably weighted wood, specific gravity wise, and you're using the shape of your head, size and shape of the head, size and shape, and the density of your frog and button material, then you're going to end up in the in an acceptable range.
And you can also adjust the balance point with your wrap too.
Yeah, to a certain extent. And different players are going to like different balances too. I'm not a huge fan of the homogenization of bows, trying to make everything within a certain narrow parameter. But we'll see what it is when we're done here. So, okay, I is ready to sand, and I'm going to do that off camera, but I'm going to show you how I sand my stick here before we go. So we're close to an hour anyways. Okay, so I'm going to use, I think this is 150 grit paper. So I'm just going to fold it around the stick like this and then sand it. It just makes too much of a mess here in the shop, so I'll sand it. It's nice when there's a little bit of a breeze, when you can have it go away from you as you're sanding. And then I will use, from there I'll use 400 grit sandpaper. And that's my final sanding for the stick. So we're going to go outside and I'm going to get this sanded down. So I'm just going to sand from here to here for right now. And then I do the head and the butt of the stick back here at the bench.
Okay, so we're at 59 minutes. Do you want to end it here?
Yeah, we'll end it here, and we'll see you in 15 minutes.